I was walking down the streets of Concord with one of my friends, and 5 cop cars pulled up around me. And a police officer came out and said, "We have a picture of you. You're a runaway. We know you're a nomad." And I was like terrified. I thought I was going to be arrested. I thought I was going to be shot. I was looking at their guns. They were telling me that I was running away. I was living on the train tracks. I was a nomad. And they finally took me to my dad. And my dad was like, "Yeah, that's my daughter." And they were like, "Why is she dressed like this?"
Welcome to Seacoast Stories, a podcast about the people, businesses, and newsmakers that make the Seacoast an American hidden gem. I'm Trey Farkas, and on today's episode, a local fortune teller's lifelong battles against discrimination, illness, loss, and why she's a loud voice in a community that hardly has any voice at all. Today's story starts in December 2023. The soundbite you just heard is from a conversation I had last year with Jezmina Von Thiele on the Found Generation podcast, a previous show of mine. In the 4 years I've been hosting podcasts, that episode is the single most viewed episode I've ever released. As with everything on the internet these days, the comments were heated on both sides. Some listeners told Jezmina to, quote, "stop stealing cars," and others applauded Jezmina for her strength. In that conversation, we talked about how Jezmina got into fortune telling, but also about her proud heritage as a Romani person. Let me pause and ask you, do you know what a Romani person is? Do you know where the Roma come from? If you answer no, like I did before meeting Jezmina, you're not alone. Most people have no idea where the Romani people come from, let alone that they even exist. The Roma are a diasporic ethnic group, originally from India around the 10th century. Over the ensuing centuries, Roma slowly trickled throughout the globe as they fled persecution, forced deportations, slavery, and genocide. Today, Roma live all over the world. There's 1 million Romani people in the United States, and they're actually the largest ethnic minority in Europe. Perhaps you're more familiar with the term gypsy. It's a slur used in place of Roma, and it's a term that elicits all kinds of stereotypes about the Romani people, that they're nomads, runaways, thieves, or that they're out to gyp you. Of course, that's false. But what's undoubtedly true about the Romani people is that fortune telling is a key part of their story. In Jezmina's words, it's a survival trade, a way for Roma to make a living in a world that often bars them from finding any work at all. Jezmina grew up in New Hampshire, and she currently tells fortunes at Deadwick's in Portsmouth. She's a loud voice in her community, and she certainly doesn't shy away from telling the story of her people. She's taught Romani studies in college. She co-hosts a popular podcast called Romanistan. And she's also the author of a brand new book out today, and it's called The Secrets of Romani Fortune Telling. In this episode, we speak less about the discrimination she's faced as a Romani person, but more about the many layers to her being. Why she identifies as non-binary, why she was once capable of talking to horses, and how long COVID stripped her of everything that she thought she knew about herself. It's likely a conversation unlike anything you've heard before. And we begin by looking back on our podcast from last year and why Romani content draws such a loud response on the internet.
I think it can be really fun to be a hater. I think people like to feel right and righteous, and it's hard to want to take that away from people. So I do not look at the comments or really anything that I produce that I'm not personally responsible for producing. So for instance, if I post it on my Instagram because it's my Romanistan podcast episode or something, I have to monitor the comments, all of that. But I'm definitely not looking on Reddit to see what people say about me or looking at any other things that I do on other shows or platforms because I don't hate myself and I need to maintain my mental health. And what I've noticed is that with the content that we produce, we tend to find that the highest performing posts, for instance, a recent one about the bronze medal boxer from Hungary, Melinda Tsika. She's a Romani. She wrote this really powerful essay about how hard it was growing up in Hungary, facing a tremendous amount of racism and just really not being able to get a job, get an apartment. And she turned to a form of work that a lot of marginalized people have found success in, which is boxing. And she's really, really good. And so she wrote this really powerful essay about how boxing helped her overcome all of these huge obstacles. And it was probably one of our most popular posts. And after a certain amount of time, I had to shut down comments because the flood of hatred was so overwhelming that it was starting to get to me, even though I'm sort of used to people writing back like, go back to India, Hitler didn't get enough of you. Like, I'm used to all of that. But I was just like, this is like too hard. And I like to block and delete all of that because I want Romanisan podcast to be a safe place where Roma can go and look at positive content about Roma and feel good about it and not see like neo-Nazis or, other kind of ignorant people. And so I think I've noticed a few things. Usually female presenting people tend to get the most hatred, especially the darker their skin, the more hate they get. And also those people who are proud of both their ethnicity and what they're doing in the world if they're successful. I'm actually curious about why you think it's the most highest performing piece of content that you have put out on that podcast. But I'm assuming, people feel a certain way about Romani people, and hate also drives an algorithm. People love to be outraged. And then maybe there are people who personally have issues with how I present. In the Romani community, I'm not universally loved. I don't think anyone is. I'm mixed, I'm assimilated, I'm queer, I'm coming from a really specific angle. And there's a lot of fear of infiltration in the Romani community. But then, I don't know, maybe also fortune telling is fun and I love to talk. And maybe that could have been fun as well if we're looking at, the less negative aspect of it. Why do you think it did well?
You touched on it. The cynic in me knows that algorithms thrive off potentially hate-filled things. Mm-hmm. So anytime there's an opportunity to amplify, because people, as you alluded to, there's a lot of people who love to hate watch, who love to leave comments. And so I think the tech companies, not only YouTube, but ditto across Meta and TikTok, anything that has the potential to draw a big negative reaction, they will push.
Yeah.
And so I think that's why so many people from around the world saw this thing beyond my audience, which is unfortunate, but that's how the internet works.
So at the top of the episode, I talked about the Romani people and their prevalency in Europe. Now, your grandmother, who was in Europe during World War II times, not a good time for anyone, but especially the Romani people, who were also a part of the Holocaust, which is often not talked about, but they were sought out by the Germans as well. Why did she decide to come to the US in the 1950s? And why did she decide that New England was the right place for her to be?
Germany was still really bad. It didn't really get any easier. And and she was 19 and she just... Yeah, so this is a little bit heavy. Do you mind if I get into
Please.
some? Yeah, she was very frank with me and was like, I could not find a job where I was not being sexually assaulted, just universally, anywhere she worked. And she also was hiding her Romani ethnicity. She was lighter skinned and she had, her family had been taken in by a German farmer. And there was just a lot of the low key kind of espionage of people trying to hide. And she felt really disconnected from the Romani community because she grew up apart from them. And so, she was like, I got to get out of here. And she met this very charming American soldier who turned out to be totally deranged, but he did bring her to America and she started a family. And so, she landed a little outside of Boston, I think in Malden, maybe.
And your grandmother, she bestowed a lot of her fortune-telling knowledge upon you, but it was something that she did not necessarily want you to pursue as a career, right?
It was an interesting message that I was getting, because Paulina Stevens, who's my co-host and co-author, she was in this fantastic podcast series put out by the LA Times called Foretold. Highly recommend you listen. She grew up in the kind of family that's one way of being Romani, which is very traditional, much more insular. The women in her family were respected, talented fortune tellers. And so it was just sort of expected that that was what she was going to do. She was going to leave school at 12. She was going to learn to be a wife and mother and fortune teller. She had an arranged marriage when she was 17. And that was kind of the way her life folded and unfolded. Foretold tells the story of her leaving that arranged marriage and figuring out who she is. Not necessarily only outside of the community, because she left her small community, but, the larger Romani community has embraced her and obviously loves her too. So my grandmother was like, baby, we're in America now. And also, this is the job that we did. And also, I have a tremendous amount of pride that we are Roma. And also, though, please don't tell anyone because we will get murdered. She came with so much fear. And I didn't get murdered, but I got bullied a lot, which we talked about in the last episode. So the way she put it was like, this is the job that our ancestors have done forever. I don't even know how long. I would like to teach you because it is always going to be a good job no matter what you do. And I don't think that my family ever really expected that I would make a lot of money or be super successful in anything I did.
Wow.
And not in a way where it's you're not capable, but just yeah, that's unlikely for anyone, right? But I don't think my grandmother expected that I would become a full-time fortune teller because that seemed too much like wearing my identity on my sleeve, which was very dangerous to her. And I think she also just didn't really know that that was something that you could still do. I think she thought of that as something that was her grandmother, who's on my business card, was the last nomadic, full-time performer, fortune teller, and kind of was the last one to have that life because then, World War II started happening.
You wear your identity very proudly. So the queer non-binary aspect of this, I know this isn't fortune telling related, but I do think it's worth noting. On a recent episode of the show, I spoke to a bisexual woman who works at Connections Peer Support in downtown Portsmouth, which is a very cool peer support center. And we were talking about the LGBTQIA plus community, which I know you were a proud supporter of.
Yeah.
And so identifying as queer, non-binary, these are terms a lot of people probably think they know, and then they ask you to define them. And it's wait, actually, what does that mean? So can you set the record straight for us?
Yeah.
And tell us what those terms mean and why you so proudly identify.
I like to specify too that I think everyone's interpretation of those things is highly personal if that's something you identify with. So I'll definitely give how I identify, but I always think it's great to find out how other people do too, and that's the best way to learn. Okay, so for queerness, I love the word queer. I know that not everybody does. I could also fall under the umbrella of bisexual or pansexual. Basically, I like everybody if I'm feeling it. Gender is not anything that I use to distinguish a potential connection. I don't feel like my sexual identity is the biggest part of me, and at the same time, it is a huge part of me. And a lot of that is, first, my mother really, really struggled with accepting who I was, and I really was not encouraged to come out at all. I think I was probably 6 when I realized that I was oh, I like boys and girls just as much.
Oh, wow.
I have a crush on Regina, and I also have a crush on Corey, and this is cute. So I was really keeping a lot under wraps and really repressing the crap out of my own sexuality. And I had a lot of other challenging things going on when I was a kid. And I tried to talk to my mom about it, and she got very freaked out and shut it down immediately. And so I was well into my 20s before I was okay, yeah, I'm queer though. And this is a really big part of me. And it really is so painful for me to pretend that I'm not. And I just want to be in queer spaces where this is safe. And I don't want my family to hate me. And when I came out, finally, when we were Christmas shopping to my mother in Walmart, because I love a little drama, she kind of froze and didn't say anything for about a half an hour. And then, And then she was like, did you notice how well I took that? I was like, sure. But what's interesting is that my dad was just like, oh, cool. Good for you. And I wish I had told him first,
Right.
because I had no idea that he would have had that response. And he's just been very supportive. And so my queerness is just like a part of who I am. And for me, I don't really distinguish anywhere along the gender binary. I could potentially fall in love with you. It's possible. So the non-binary part, that is also something that I think can be difficult to define, because some people feel more gender fluid, where if we think about gender as a spectrum, they might be flowing anywhere along that spectrum at any time. For me, I feel more like gender doesn't totally encapsulate what my experience is. And this was another thing that I was really trying to repress for a long time. The first time I heard about non-binary identity, because I'm old, I'm almost 40. I was probably like in my late 20s, early 30s. And my first reaction to it was like fear and anger, which is not usually how I react to new things. And I was like, okay, I would guess that there's something coming up here that's connected to how difficult it was to keep these things down as a kid. And it was actually when I became really, really, really ill. I already had chronic health issues. I got COVID in 2020, then have been disabled from long COVID since then. And I was like bedridden for a few months and just, gained a lot of weight, had to start walking with a cane. And before that, I think I was like doing some part-time modeling. I was a professional dancer. I was doing a lot that celebrated the hyper feminine performance of my body. And that was a place where I felt safe, because I was sort of raised that the most valuable thing about me from my mother was that I was young and strong and beautiful. And so when that was stripped away and I was sick and no one was seeing me and I couldn't move and I couldn't even really think or read, all of a sudden I was like, oh my God, I am so much more than a feminine presentation. I am so much more than like my performative femininity that I do really just to feel safer in the world. And it's one of those things that feels so personal to me that if I wasn't doing public facing things where I have a whole like platform where I'm like, Roma can be queer and trans and all these things, and we can be whatever we want to be, I don't know if I would have come out, but I started feeling like I should, because this might be helpful to someone, because I really needed that when I was younger.
Yeah, this is something that I'm so in awe of, Jezmina. You've been discriminated against your whole life. For being Roma, that's enough. Like just dealing with that and enough in itself. And then discrimination from, like, you're taking bullets from every direction. Why do you, because I imagine a lot of people who are a part of a minority would just choose to not proudly identify as that thing, just try to blend in, just try to keep a quiet profile so that they don't attract any haters. But you are leaning into every different aspect of your identity, which are things that often draw a lot of criticism from people. Why do you choose to be so loud about it as opposed to just keeping a low profile?
I just did not have a lot of support or role models growing up. Everyone in my family I love, and they were doing their best, but they were struggling with huge trauma and challenges. And yeah, I really needed like every representation of queerness or Romaness that was even a little bit positive, something I could latch on to just to feel okay in my body. Because I still didn't feel safe in my body. I felt a tremendous amount of shame. I felt dirty, like, because this was all the trauma that my family was carrying with them. And rushing through the house with my mother and her scrubbing wildly, being like, well, we don't want people to think we're dirty gypsies. It was just like this idea that there was something inherently wrong with me. And then coupled with like childhood abuse and illness and things like that, I just desperately needed more than I got. And so I kind of feel like if I am going to represent this community in any way, which is wild because it wasn't actually something that I sought to do. I'm a writer and I started writing about my experiences. And then that very quickly became more. I feel like it's my responsibility to be honest about who I am, especially if that could be helpful to anyone. And we do get really, really sweet messages of like queer, trans, non-binary, young Roma who are like, this made me feel better. And I'm just like, that's all I've ever wanted. So it's really, that's so worth it.
We didn't really talk about this the last time. So you got COVID and that became into long COVID.
Yeah. Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah. So the Ides of March 2020, I was in the hospital for an ovarian cyst burst, which apparently is serious. So that was the first time I recognized that that's something you should go to the hospital for.
Miserable.
It was miserable. And so I was quite sick. And literally the day I was like staggering into the hospital, I saw someone taping up a sign that was like, maybe we should wear masks because it was just so fresh in New York. And I was like, well, I don't have a mask on me and they weren't supplying them. And I was just like, okay. So I went in and did my procedure and everything and came out the same day and then started feeling sick. And by that time, everything had shut down in New York, total panic. And I started losing my taste and smell. And I was like, oh, fuck, here it goes. But even though, so I've had probably fibromyalgia since I was 5, it's still, the diagnosis still isn't clear. And so I've had chronic illness since I was a small child, usually presenting in like staggering nerve pain and sensitivity to textures or cold, exhaustion, chronic fatigue, all that kind of stuff. I was a dancer. I was a yoga teacher. I was super strong. I was walking or biking like 10 miles a day sometimes because I had been sick since I was a kid. I was like, I'm going to be very, very strong and take excellent care of myself. And so I went into that feeling like, I've got this. But I did not got that. So like I had 3 days where I could barely breathe. And my doctor was saying like, listen, the hospitals are overcrowded. They have people and bodies like in the hallways. If you can breathe, don't go to the hospital. But I was like, I can kind of breathe. And I was also in a very kind of dark mentality where I was like, I don't want to be responsible for giving someone else the plague. If I need to die quietly in my room, I have made peace with my God. I can do this, which is like, this is the place that you get when you are isolated, when there's an unprecedented pandemic, when you've been sick and feeling unworthy your whole life. So that was sort of like the dark night of the soul that I was in. And I had to lay on my stomach with my head hanging over the bed, just focusing on breathing for like 3 days. But I made it through. And I thought, great, I'll get better soon. And the recovery was really, really slow. But I am someone with a lot of fire in me. And so I was like trying to dig up a garden. And then I would collapse over the dirt pile for like 20 minutes and sleep. And then I'd wake up and start digging again. Like I didn't understand the concept of rest. I haven't before until this point. And I had this really wild experience where, so that happened in March. I'm trying to recover through the summer. In my family, signs, et cetera, like that are very important. I was walking my dog. I had been able to walk again. And there was the biggest dead crow I'd ever seen in my path. And crows are kind of a thing in my family because it's, the men in my family a long, long time ago used to charm crows and perform with them, which I just always thought was the coolest thing in the world. And so I feel an affinity for crows for that reason. And I saw this crow and I had this immediate knowledge that someone in my family was going to die. And I thought, well, it's probably my grandmother, right? Because I couldn't think of who else. And I got this very clear message from Spirit, like, you need to go see your family. And I was already quarantining, but I was very, very, very careful for 2 weeks. Didn't talk to anyone, see anyone, anything like that. Drove up, no stops, and all the way to New Hampshire. Got there. It was my mother's birthday weekend. And my mother and I had a very complicated relationship. She was very mentally ill. She had struggled with so much trauma. And so I understand why she was the way she was. And she asked me sort of out of the blue, like, is there anything you want to tell me about your life with me so far? Is there anything that you want to tell me, how you feel, any anger or resentment you're feeling? And I was like, that's absolutely a trap. But I thought about it and I was like, no, I just want to have a good relationship with you moving forward. Like, I'm happy to put the past in the past and move forward. And she said, okay, if you're sure. Like she didn't believe me because she was a monster. And then we celebrated her birthday. And then the next day she died in my arms. She had a stroke. My dad and I were trying to give her CPR. It didn't work. And we called the ambulance and everything. They couldn't revive her. And after that point, something about the grief took a tremendous toll on my body. And one of my friends came to visit me and she had just the slightest bit of a cold. And I got so sick. Again, it almost took me out of this world. And that's when I was bedridden for months. It was like whatever virus was activated came back and I couldn't speak for months. My respiratory system was so messed up. I was in excruciating pain. I could barely walk. I, at the time, was teaching middle school online. I couldn't read or write. Like my brain fog was so dense. It was outrageous. And I had to quit my job because I literally could not read. And that was like my primary thing. And so that's when I decided when I was well enough to start speaking and functioning and I needed to start working again. Because I was living with my dad, but he's not like rich or anything. And so I started fortune telling because I could talk, and I started podcasting because I could talk, and I got a cane, which, I don't have to use every second of every day, but it helps me a lot with my mobility. And I've been very, very slowly making progress through really alternative medicine. I've tried combo, which is a frog venom, which was incredibly helpful, and like lidocaine shots. But that's, my own journey. Everyone has their own ways of healing, and just like very, very persistently trying to do exercises to build up strength and rebuild connections in my brain and body and try to alleviate nerve pain. And I've always lived with chronic pain, but it got to a whole new level I didn't know it could get to.
Wow. That is a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
I'm sorry you had to deal with that. I can't imagine what it was like seeing those signs and then losing your mother like that so quickly.
It was wild. And the strangest thing too is that after her death, just almost everyone in her family is gone now. It was just one after another after another.
Right. And your grandmother, who you were very close with, passed away last year, right?
Yeah. She actually died the day I finished the first draft of the book.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So identity has been, a common theme of this conversation so far. And I'm just curious, as someone who was so physically active for so long, a yoga teacher, dancer, like these were parts of your identity. And then being a writer and a reader, part of your identity.
Yes.
And then being unable to do those for a while. What was that like?
I mean, it was brutal. It was so interesting though, because I am a very spiritual person. And I was reflecting on how I was like, yeah, everything I've ever identified with has been stripped away from me. And all the things that I can do in this world have been taken. What am I supposed to do? Because I definitely am one of those people who I feel like I have to like earn my rent on this planet by doing everything all the time.
Same. Very fire of you.
Yes, a fire of us. So I really sought refuge in TV, which you wouldn't think would be profound, but it actually was, because I was like, yeah, this is connecting me to humanity and hope and humor and narrative and storytelling in a way that I can actually enjoy, because I couldn't process what I was reading, but I could process a lot of what I was hearing. And I just had to sort of lean into it and be like, well, okay, this is where I am right now. I can't pretend anything else. I can grieve it, which is normal, but I can't be angry or resentful at my body, because when I really thought about it, my body's been through hell. Like, it's been through, childhood abuse and illness, domestic violence, like all these different things that I'd, endured and just kept going. And even just the way I handled my illness was always like, well, if I just work harder, then maybe I won't be sick, which is not how that works. And so I really had to just radically rest and also ask for help in ways that I hadn't before. And a lot of times when I asked for help from people, they didn't know how to give it or didn't feel comfortable. And other times people really stepped up in really meaningful ways. And I had to just really love myself where I was. And, 5 years ago, the idea of gaining 50 pounds would have I would have been ashamed, but I would have been like, oh no, I would never. But I just got to a point where I was so sick and I'm like, I'm still hungry. Like, I can't move and I'm hungry and so little is giving me pleasure. And I'm not eating like trash or anything. I'm just eating. Whereas normally, if I'm not putting out this caloric output, I'm not going to eat like more than this time, many times a day. And it's just like all of that just sort of went out the window. And I started just really actually learning how to love and care for my body and nurture it into health. Because in all honesty, I was always on the verge of a massive health crisis. Like I was constantly pushing myself too hard, and you cannot do that. Like the body will take you down because it has to.
We don't need to get into the ins and outs of this because it won't be productive for this conversation, but child abuse, domestic abuse, online abuse, all sorts of things that you've suffered throughout your life. Have you ever just asked, why me?
Not really. I think I've definitely had those times where I'd be like, I think deserve a break. Like I've had those moments.
Chill out.
Yeah.
Throw me a bone here.
But when especially not so much, especially in the context of my family where I grew up also with everyone else's horror stories. And so my grandmother and her horrific stories from Nazi Germany. And then like as an immigrant, my mother and my auntie and my uncles who I adore and their tremendous lineage of trauma, like the hell that my grandfather wreaked on everyone. And so while I was going through profoundly difficult things that I deserved help for and should have gotten, it was totally unremarkable to my family. It was just like, yeah, these things happen to children. Isn't that awful? Welcome to the club. Like that was just sort of the energy around it, because I don't think that they ever learned to love and care for themselves and envision a different opportunity.
Is there any hope for you to be able to take the cane away and get back to the active lifestyle you used to have?
Maybe. I am really excited about the progress I've been making, but I've also just like really learned to love and appreciate the cane because
Bedazzle it a little bit,
Her name is Griselda. and so I tend not to see that as like, I don't see it as anything negative. It's like a mobility aid and it helps me do more. And so I see it as something that's actually like increasing my mobility, because when I wasn't using it, I was really struggling. And someone had said to me like, girl, why don't you just get a cane? And I was like, oh my God, I never even thought of this. What a brilliant idea. And so I do feel like I'm making progress, but I also don't really know what's in store. I thought I knew in 2020 that what my life was going to look like physically, because I was, having green smoothies and exercising so much, but I did not know. And so right now I'm just taking it one day at a time. And I've been able to do like 10 minutes on like a reclining bike, which has been a huge deal. And like on really good days, I can add 5 minutes, but I can feel the 5 minutes the next day because there's weird stuff happening in my body. So I'm just going slow, but I'm optimistic. I'm seeing progress.
I'm optimistic as well. This is amazing to hear. I'm sure a big part of your recovery has been fortune telling, pursuing that as a career, starting the podcast, now writing this book. How instrumental has fortune telling been in your healing process?
I think it's been very helpful, even just from the basic thing where I needed to use language. And fortune telling also helps me start to recover language, because a part of the way that I read is I do a little bit of channeling. And so it feels like the language is coming to me rather than from me. So that was incredibly helpful. And I was actually asked to write the book while I still couldn't read or write. Someone, because they had found my work before at Wiser Books, had reached out to me and asked if I would write a book. And I was like, I'm definitely one of those people where it's like, you don't say no to an opportunity, even if you're not sure you can do it. You say yes, and then you do your best with it. And I was like, sure, I could write a book. But I was honest with them and I was like, I'm recovering from illness. It's going to take me a minute, but if you can be patient. And they were patient, and it took me a while to figure it out. I decided I wanted to write it with Paulina, and all that time I was trying to actively do things to help my brain reconnect to language. And because this work that I do is my life's work, it was actually once I gained the ability to like write longer than a little text message or like a little Instagram post or something, I just was flying all of a sudden. And Paulina and I wrote it together over Zoom sessions, and we brainstormed a lot. And she's really, really busy. And so sometimes the things we would brainstorm, I would like transcribe what she was saying, which was also good for me to like increase my language ability again. Yeah, it came together with so much joy because it wasn't just like, oh, it's my first book, which as a writer who hasn't written a book and I'm like in my 30s, that's like, oh, about time. But also it's like, this is my first book after a crippling illness where I lost the ability to read and write.
Yeah. How does it feel emotionally to have this accomplishment in your back pocket now? Is something that I'm sure you grew up dreaming about, writing a book, and then to have it come on the back end of all of these things you've dealt with in the last few years.
I think it's interesting that this book came out when almost everyone in my family, on my mom's side of the family specifically, who is connected to the Romani culture, has passed away. And so I felt very much like I was writing it with their spirits, but at the same time, as humans, you know, they were really complicated, and I don't think they would have necessarily been happy for me that I was doing this work. It's too much. It's putting myself out there too much. Who do I think I am? Kind of thing. Because, you know, they were in a challenging place. So it's weirdly like, I feel like their spirits are probably happier for me than their persons would have been. And I did absolutely write it for them, even, you know, it was a gift no one wanted. But at the same time, it's also something that a lot of Romani people have expressed. Like, I wish there was a book about Romani fortune telling by Roma that was like intersectional and representative of how diverse we are. And so, you know, Paulina and I were so happy that lots of Romani people, artists, fortune tellers, writers, holistic healers contributed quotes to the book because we really wanted it to feel like a reflection of the community, not just the two of us. And I think Paulina and I are a good point and counterpoint to each other because she grew up traditional, insular. I grew up mixed, assimilated. It's two sides of that spectrum. And yet there's so much that we share in the way that we approach this. And we really, really care about adding the cultural context of tarot, palmistry, tea leaves, all these things that people don't realize, like maybe you could be engaging with them in a way that's appropriative, or maybe you could be enjoying more of them. So it felt very crucial. And I also have a very hard time feeling like I deserve anything good. I'm working on it in therapy. And so I'm really trying to be like, yes, I did a book with my bestie and that was really meaningful. And I should be proud.
You should be proud. It's an amazing accomplishment. It's called Secrets of Romani Fortune Telling. It delves into a lot of the basics of some of the different disciplines, if you will, from coffee reading, tea leaf reading, tarot card, palm reading. You get into a lot of the basics, but you also get into a lot of just the ethics of fortune telling, the business of it, how much you should charge, what's the proper way to conduct yourself, all sorts of different angles to it that I didn't really think about. I tweezed out a few anecdotes from the book that I want to ask you about. Okay. Your go-to move on first dates was to give palm readings.
Yes. Back in the day.
Why?
It is many things. So the first thing is it's very cute, right? Like you get to hold their hand immediately and you're making eye contact. I mean, a certain way that you do it. Obviously, when I'm working with a client, like I am not trying to make it like a moment between us. But if you're at a bar and they're not a client and it's just like, this is a fun thing. Do you want me to take a look at your palm? And it was something that I would only do for maybe just a few minutes where I tell them like their basic element and maybe some interesting things that stuck out to me about them. I definitely wasn't trying to talk to them about their like childhood trauma or anything vulnerable. But it was also a way for me to size up if I thought that we would be compatible at all. And so I was not telling them everything that I was looking at and also just sort of figuring out like, could I reasonably like really connect with this person?
Interesting.
But yeah, definitely like an excuse to hold hands and have like a moment is a big part of it.
Now going back to the ethics of this in Harry Potter to equate it, obviously, if you use magic outside of the magical setting, like you're hit with a punishment.
Yeah.
So if to use palm reading on a first date to learn about this person more, is that against the ethic code?
I don't think so, because we all have ways of sizing people up, right? Like when someone first walks in on a first date and they are maybe wearing like a suit and then like flip-flops, you're like, flip-flops? And you like take a moment and you kind of like flick back like, yeah, no, I think I heard that people who wear incongruent shoes, it's like a little bit of a red flag. There's something going. I don't think it's that different. Or like if we're analyzing the way that they speak or how they like hold your gaze, did they ask you any questions about yourself? I don't think it's that different.
Okay. Now, can you tell me about the time that you communicated with a horse?
Yeah, this is a strange chapter of my life. And I'm not sure I could do this work again, but maybe I could. But basically, my mother recognized that in New Hampshire at the time, which would have been like maybe 2000 or something, or maybe like 1999, fortune telling was not popular. The spiritual arts were like too spooky and weird for New Hampshire. This was something that I wasn't getting a tremendous amount of business for. So she didn't feel like I was practicing enough. And what she did notice, though, because she worked with horses with my aunt, a lot of people had things wrong with their horses that they couldn't figure out. They would take them to the vet and it would be like, I don't know why she's lame. Or like, this horse is always spooking at this tarp, or this horse is biting everybody. And they were just like desperate to find out what was wrong with these horses. And my mother was like, she was very smart. She was like, I bet they would pay a child to intuit, because it's like, it was $20 for a reading. And it was just like, what's there to lose, really? Maybe this will help. So my mother wanted me to read for horses. I had no training with horses. I was a little bit afraid of them. My mom took it very personally that I really took to fortune telling and not the work that she was doing, which was more with horses. And I was like, I am 12 and I'm really scared. I don't know about this. And she was like, well, I mean, if you can read for people, you should be able to read for horses. So they're even harder because they don't speak our language and they have different cues, but you should be able to figure it out. It's like, okay. So she didn't go in with me because I, needed to learn. And I knew this horse bit everyone in the face and kicked everyone. I was really scared. Horses are huge. And so I stood outside the stall and I did what my grandmother told me to. I did this meditation where I clear my mind, imagining clouds as my thoughts blowing away. And I knew my grandmother had taught me all about plant and animal communication. It's not exactly like the dog whisperer or anything, but it's just this idea that if you are connected by breath and heartbeat to a plant or an animal, there's a certain amount of connection or even information you can convey or receive. And so I got into that state of mind. It took me 15 minutes to do it. I was really scared. And I was trying to tell the horse as clearly as possible, I'm just in here to try to help you. I know that you've been unhappy. Please, if you are comfortable with it, let me stand next to you and I'll see if I can help. And I opened the stall door and I walked up to him and he was just like, okay. He just seemed fine. So I walked in and I put my hands on him and I'm checking in, is this okay with you? Okay. And as soon as I put my hands on him, I had a flood of information. And so I don't market myself as a psychic or medium because it comes when it comes. All of a sudden I had this flood of information where he was like, they play the radio so loud and it's this kind of music. I don't like this kind of music. I like this other kind of music. And he kind of played for me in my head, some classical music. And I was like, okay. And he's like, I don't like that horse and I don't like all these things. And everyone's too loud in the morning. And he was just had this list of complaints. And I was like, okay. And I gave him some peppermints and some carrots. And I was like, thank you so much. And so I told everyone who was terrified of this horse, I was like, please change the radio station. He doesn't want it in his stall anymore. It's too loud for him. Doesn't like that horse next to him. Change this up. Let me know if it gets any better. And it did. He stopped biting and kicking everyone. He was just so chill. And then everyone in the barn was like, why is my horse afraid of tarps? And had me check in with their horses. And I was able to help a good number of them. And I think because I was so young and just very non-judgmental and it was presented as entirely normal, I wasn't in my head about it at all. I didn't think anything I was doing was extraordinary. I thought I was doing the very bare minimum of what was expected of me and my family. And so I had no ego about it. But I think that once I got older, especially in college, someone asked me to read for a horse again. And I was like, I don't know if I can do that anymore because I was in my head about it. And so my next thing is overcome that blockage.
Wow, that is a wild story. Something that also caught my attention in the book was you talked about intuition. And when we think of fortune tellers, I think a lot of us think that those fortune tellers, they're born with something different. They're not like us. They're magical. They have special powers going on. But you said in the book that no, everyone is born with intuition. We could, every one of us, we don't have to be a Romani person to be able to communicate with a horse in that same way that you did. The difference just is that you guys practice and develop those skills, but I have the capability to do that too, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think everyone has inherent intuition. And Oksana Marafiati, who's this great, writer and academic, we quoted her in the book, and she was explaining that, from her perspective, it seems like intergenerational trauma actually has a huge amount to do with this intuition, because if you and your ancestors for centuries have been having to read subtle signs and read a room and in your life and death situations and be able to tell like who might be lying or, all these different things, it's going to be something that you pass down, whether you do it by teaching or just through living in the world and having the kids around you observe that. And so I think that for me, it's really important to make clear that like Roma are not like inherently magical or special in those ways. Like, yeah, we have like all this fun culture and all these things, and in the way that everyone is special. So we're not inherently magical. I do believe everyone has their own intuition. I'm sure everyone who's listening has had those moments of like gut feeling, whether it's just like that person is sketchy or if it's like, I probably shouldn't park here. And we've probably also had that experience of when you ignore that gut feeling.
Oh, yeah.
You're like, I knew it. I knew it. And so I think it can be a really interesting thing to just play with trusting yourself, especially in, situations where there's nothing really to lose or maybe only things to gain. It's okay if you want to piece out of somewhere because it feels right to you, just follow that. And if that's something you want to develop, I think these tools are really helpful, tarot, palmistry, tea leaf reading, but there's so many different ways to develop your intuition and it's really endless.
You wrote in the book that in Europe, Roma are the largest minority in Europe. Now there's about 1 million Romani people dispersed throughout the United States, concentrations in some of our nation's biggest cities, but in Europe, the largest minority. And you wrote that it's the human rights crisis that no one is talking about, which I think is so true. I mean, we hear about all of the problems in this world and the certain groups that are targeted and discriminated against. And you never really see the headlines about Romani people being persecuted. Why is that?
Yeah, I think that still a lot of anti-Romani racism is totally socially acceptable, especially in Europe. But I also think that people so rarely come into contact with Roma in the US, or at least they think that they do. I'm sure plenty of people have met lots of Roma. There are 1 million of us here, but just didn't know. So there's a lack of representation and visibility. There's very little media that shows like real Romani stories. We have a little bit of an influx with that, with the Polish Netflix series Infamia, and other media like Alina Serban was in the movie Housekeeping for Beginners, which I think was a really wonderful depiction of Romani people. The feminist theater troupe Juve Le Pen does a lot, but these are still sort of niche things that people would find, not necessarily mainstream. So there's that. There's still a lot of anti-Romani laws in the US, but especially in Europe. There's a kind of lack of political cohesion. We're still really looking for representation as a stateless nation in some of these crucial organizations. And so when there's not that organization, I think that it's hard to know about these issues. There's also the idea that the word gypsy has sort of come to mean other things. And so people have this really romanticized vision of what that means. And sometimes it has nothing to do with the ethnicity. It just hasn't been challenged too much. And some of it is because of all those reasons. Like sometimes we fall in love with musicians or pop stars or things like that. And their Romani identity is often something that is sort of downplayed if they become very popular. Maybe not necessarily by them, but even by the media. Like Cher Lloyd, the British pop singer, is Romani, but like it's not a huge facet of the way that she presents, which is absolutely not a criticism of her. She's doing great. But, but I can see why it wouldn't be.
What is the biggest misunderstanding you would say that people like me, non-Roma, is it gadje?
Oh, gadje.
Gadje?
Yeah.
That's the term for non-Roma people.
Yeah, gadje, yeah.
What is the biggest misconception that gadje people have about Romani people?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of them. Like, I think the inherent criminality one is part of it, or just like the free-spirited, like magical, super magical, free-spirited or super seductive. Also that we don't exist. I'd heard from like a grown-ass lady with all the love in the world where she's like, I thought that Roma were magical creatures. I didn't know that you were real people. I thought it was like fairies and elves. And like she thought that's what a gypsy was. And I'm like, yeah, with the media you were raised on, I'm not at all surprised. Yeah. that's a symptom of media representation. But there are all kinds of wild things that people come up with. I had someone who was legitimately afraid that I was going to curse them after we had like a disagreement. And I was just like, oh boy, you don't have to bring all that to me. That's an inside thought.
And the evil eye. What exactly is the evil eye?
Yeah, so it has a lot of different names. Basically, the idea is that you can cast the evil eye without even knowing that you're doing it if you're looking at someone with like envy or jealousy. And usually the people who are thought to be like the most like in danger of the evil eye would be women, especially pregnant women, babies, and children. And so I think that like being online a lot or like being really visible on Instagram is definitely like an invitation for the evil eye. And a lot of people will do like cleansing and protecting, but it's sort of like the reason why we have superstitions and like a lot of cultures, because the evil eye is something that people believe in like all over the world. It's a really, really, really old belief that it's like, oh, I shouldn't talk about this good thing before it happens in case something happens. Because the idea is that maybe someone's jealous and they either energetically or like through their behavior, like try to make it not happen for you. Because sometimes people are just terrible too. So
gosh, I've had a lot of evil eye in my life.
Yeah.
The book is called Secrets of Romani Fortune Telling. You are already on tour for this. You've made a couple pit stops, many in the New England area, several stops in Portsmouth, in Portland, in Exeter, and you're also going to be in New Orleans, and I think potentially out in Los Angeles as well. What are you most excited about?
I mean, I am excited about all of the things. My short list, we're doing something October 18th at Chagall Pack in Salem, Massachusetts. And that is also a Roma-owned art space.
Very cool.
And so I'm really, really excited. We'll be doing something with House Witch in Peabody. And so we're doing lots of rituals and workshops in some of those bigger events. So that's a fun way to find us. But then also, I'm so excited about our festival in New Orleans because that'll be December 4th through 8th. We're putting on a Romani queer, like LGBTQ plus arts and culture and spirituality festival.
Wow.
And it's going to be so fun. There's going to be dinners and an art show, performances with Water Always Wanders, this great performance art piece that's been revived from a previous show. There's going to be music and a panel and like all these great things to do at Romani Tea Room, where we teach you how to read tea leaves. And Paulina and I are both going to be there. And so that is going to be a really big deal because we haven't really had a festival like this before in the United States. And we're actively fundraising for it and seeking sponsors. And so if you're interested in sponsoring something like that or kicking into our GoFundMe, check it out on romanasanpodcast.com. And we're also going to Portland, Oregon for a whole weekend with Sea Grape Apothecary. And that's the 25th to the 27th of October. And they've been super supportive of our work. And we're doing an ancestor communication workshop, and we'll be doing readings in shops and book signings and all kinds of things. So there's just a lot of really cool stuff to look forward to.
Yeah, there's a lot going on for you, Jezmina. Okay, we've got this new book that you've co-written with Paulina Stevens. You also have the Romanistan podcast. You also do palm readings at Deadwicks.
Yeah,
in downtown Portsmouth.
Tarot palms and tea leaves. Yeah.
And people can also book you online. They can book to do virtual things. They can book you for events. You're a very busy woman.
I'm very busy.
You've taken on quite a lot for someone who is so chronically ill all the time.
Yeah, I'm still navigating rest.
I love that. Well, we have one final question, Jezmina. We ask the same final question to every guest every week at the end of the episode. So I'll ask it to you.
Hey.
Jezmina, what is the mission that you are on in your life right now?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think that there's probably two answers to this. There's the answer out of my ambition, which is like, I really want to create a world in which Roma have more access to platforms to be creative and doing all the things that they're doing. And I'd like to help facilitate that however I can. Then the second answer, that is more about being a human being. I am really, really interested in navigating rest, care, and recovery in a much more gentle and compassionate way. And I'd like to create a life in which I get to stay closer to the land and really hang out with plants a lot more and just focus on cultivating really loving relationships offline with humans, plants, and animals.
That's Jezmina Von Thiele, author, podcast host, fortune teller, and most importantly, an inspiration for all of us to be proud of where we come from. Thank you, Jezmina, for the important reminder. If you'd like to purchase her new book or check out her podcast, I've placed all the links in today's show notes. And before I go, I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you to everyone who shared the episode from last week with Vernon Family Farm, who told your friends about it, who shared the episode on Instagram. I know the Vernons were really appreciative, and I am so grateful for it as well. If you're a new listener of the podcast because of that episode, welcome. I'm so glad you found us. Just hit the follow button wherever you're listening so that you get the new episodes when they come every Monday. Speaking of which, I'll be back very soon with another conversation. But until then, if you see me at Treeline, Three Bridges Yoga, or contemplating life on a bench in Prescott Park, please stop me and say hi. I would love to hear your story. Until next week, everybody, live free or die.